The woman's fingers were still moving when Cade Rourke found her, clawing slow circles in the red canyon dirt, her body wedged between two boulders like something the flood had left behind. An Apache woman, beaded moccasins, a gash across her ribs deep enough to show white. He pressed two fingers to her throat and felt the faint stutter of a pulse, and something in him, the part that had buried his daughter 6 years ago in ground just like this, made the decision before his mind caught up. He bound her wounds with his shirt, built a low fire, stayed through the dark. By morning, 3 riders sat motionless on the ridge above him, watching. He didn't reach for his rifle, he didn't run. He simply looked up at them and waited, because he understood, without a single word passing between them, that what happened next would not be decided by a gun. Before we ride deeper into this tale, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another journey through the dust, danger, and legends of the Wild West. Now, back to the trail. He had come out to the canyon that morning for fence work, nothing more than that. The east line had been pulling loose since the spring thaw, and 3 posts had healed over in the soft ground near the wash. He'd loaded the wagon before sunup, wire, hammer, digger, 2 cans of water, and driven out in the grey pre-dawn quiet with no expectation of anything beyond a long, sore day of work. That was how most of his days ran now, one task following another without much thought between them. It was a way of living that kept grief at a manageable distance. As long as his hands were moving, his mind stayed in a narrow place, and narrow was enough. His horse, a dun gelding named Soot that he had owned for 11 years, was not given to nervous behavior. The animal had been through storms, rattlesnakes, runaway cattle, and a barn fire that had taken half the property 4 years back. He was a steady horse. That was the word Cade used for him, steady. So when Soot stopped on the canyon trail without being told, and stood with his ears forward and his weight shifted back, Cade took it seriously. He climbed down, he looped the reins over a branch. He looked around slowly, the way a man does when he's searching for something he hopes isn't there. He smelled smoke first. Old smoke, hours old, the kind that clings to rock and settles in hollows long after a fire is gone. Then he heard the sound, not a voice, not a cry, something lower than that. A sound like fingers dragging across rough stone. He found her between 2 boulders at the base of the canyon wall, in a shadow so deep he nearly stepped past her. She was on her side, one arm extended, her fingers moving in slow, purposeless circles in the red dirt. Her clothing was torn at the shoulder, and along the left side where the gash ran, the gash was bad. It had bled heavily, the rock beneath her was dark with it, but it had slowed to a seep, which meant her body had done what it could, and what it could do wasn't going to be enough much longer. She was Apache. Her clothing told him that clearly. The beadwork on her moccasins, the style of the cord at her wrist, the way her hair was pinned, all of it spoke to a people he had lived alongside for 10 years without ever fully understanding. He knew enough Apache to order water and warn a man to stop, and that was about the sum of it. But he knew what a person looked like when they were dying, and she was dying. There was an arrow shaft broken off near her left side, just below the ribs. The head was gone. He couldn't tell if it had passed through or been removed, but the wound around it was not fresh. It had been made and then abandoned. That was the detail that stopped him for a moment and made him look around at the canyon walls with a different kind of attention. This was not a battle wound. A battle wound gets treated or gets left where it falls. This wound had been made close, with the arrow angled downward, and the woman had been placed between these rocks like something set aside. Someone had put her here, between 2 boulders, out of the trail line, in the shadow. She had been left to finish dying without being seen. Cade looked at the broken cord at her wrist. The beads on it were small and blue, strung in a pattern he did not recognize, but Soot recognized something. He was still standing 20 feet back, head forward, not grazing, not shifting, just watching. Cade had learned a long time ago that horses know things men don't. He pulled his shirt off over his head and tore it into strips. He bound the gash at her ribs as tightly as he dared. He cleaned the broken arrow wound with water from one of his cans and covered it with the cleanest piece of cloth he had. He didn't know if any of it would be enough. He didn't know much about field medicine beyond what the war had taught him, and what the war had taught him was mostly about what not to do. But he worked carefully, and he worked without rushing, because rushing over an injured person was a way of making yourself feel useful without actually helping them. He built a small fire near the base of the rock, low enough to stay invisible from the ridge, hot enough to keep the temperature up through the night. He sat with his back against the boulder and his rifle across his knees and watched the canyon walls go dark as the light fell away. He didn't sleep. He thought about his daughter once, briefly, the way he always did when he was alone in the dark, not a full thought, just a shape of her, the way she had stood in the kitchen door in the early morning in her boots and her coat, ready for the day before he was. He pushed the thought down to where he kept it and returned to the sound of the woman's breathing. By the time the sky began to gray, she was still alive. Her breathing had steadied. It was shallow, but it was consistent. And then Cade looked up at the ridge, 3 riders, sitting their horses with the stillness of people who had been there for some time. The light was still gray and thin, and he couldn't make out faces or markings, but he could see the outline of bows and the line of a lance. Apache, no question. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not stand. He looked up at them and he waited, because that was the only response that made any sense. Any sudden movement in either direction would have said something he didn't want to say. So he sat still and he waited, and he let them decide what the morning was going to be. After a time, one of the riders turned his horse, and all 3 disappeared back over the ridge line. Cade exhaled slowly. He checked the woman's pulse again. Still there, faint but there. He began loading her carefully onto Soot's back for the ride home. He was still working on getting her settled across the saddle when he heard hoofbeats on the canyon trail, not from the ridge, from the south, from the direction of Reed Rock. He turned, one hand on the saddle horn, and watched Harlan Briggs come around the bend on his big gray horse, with 2 of his ranch hands trailing behind him. Harlan Briggs was the kind of man who had been big his whole life and had never had to learn to be careful. He was wide through the shoulders, loud in his opinions, and absolutely certain of his right to be wherever he happened to be standing. He had ranched the property south of Cade's for 12 years, and in 12 years had never once done Cade a favor that didn't cost something. He pulled his gray up hard when he saw what Cade was doing. For a moment he just looked. At the woman. At the blood on the rock. At Cade's bare torso, the shirt used for bandaging. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man who has just seen something he wishes he hadn't. "Cade," he said. His voice was flat. "Leave her." Cade didn't answer. "You don't know what you're getting into," Harlan said. "That's Apache business. Whatever happened to her, that's between them and whoever did it. It's got nothing to do with you." "She's alive," Cade said. "She won't be for long." Harlan shifted in his saddle. "And if you carry her out of here, whoever left her won't take kindly to you moving her. You understand what I'm telling you? There are rules out here, not written rules, but rules." "I understand you." "Then leave her." Cade checked the binding at her ribs one more time, adjusted it, and then turned to Soot and began walking the horse out of the canyon. He heard Harlan exhale behind him, a long, irritated breath. "You're going to bring trouble down on yourself, Rourke. I'm telling you plain. Don't come looking to Reed Rock for help when it arrives." Cade kept walking. He didn't look back. He got her home by mid-morning. He carried her inside and laid her on the bed in the spare room, the room that had been his daughter's, which he had not gone into much since the funeral. He opened the window to let the air move through, and he worked on her wounds properly with the supplies he kept in the tin box above the stove. He cleaned everything he could reach. He stitched the gash at her ribs with the curved needle he used for leather work, because it was what he had, and he did it with the same patience he'd used to bind her in the canyon, slow, without rushing. When he was done, he sat in the chair by the window and watched her breathe and thought about the riders on the ridge. He knew they knew where she was now. He had ridden an open trail. He had not tried to hide it. He thought that was probably the right choice, though he couldn't have explained it fully. There was something about honesty that bought more time than cleverness in situations like this, and this was a situation where time was going to matter. She didn't wake that first day, or the second. On the second evening, he heard a horse on the north side of the property, just one, walking slowly, not in a hurry. He sat on the porch and watched the tree line until the sound faded. Nobody appeared. He went back inside and made coffee and sat in the kitchen and listened to the sound of her breathing through the wall. On the third day, she moved. He heard it from the kitchen, a shift of weight on the bed, the soft sound of a hand on the blanket. He went to the door of the room and stood there. She was on her side, eyes partly open, watching him with the flat, calculating stillness of someone assessing a threat. He held up both hands, palms out. She watched him. He said nothing. After a moment, he stepped back from the doorway and went to the kitchen and came back with water in a tin cup and set it on the floor just inside the door. Then he stepped back again. She watched the cup for a long time. Then she watched him. Then she reached for the cup. He turned around and went back to the kitchen. She didn't speak to him for 4 days. She drank water. She ate the broth he left on the floor inside the door. She slept in long stretches, and when she was awake, she was quiet, so quiet that sometimes he forgot she was in the house until he heard the creak of the floorboard or the sound of her moving to the window. On the fourth night, he stepped out onto the porch after dark and found a single torch planted in the ground 30 yards from the door. It was burning steadily in the still air, which meant it had been placed there recently. He stood on the porch and looked at it for a while, and then he went back inside and sat in the kitchen with his rifle on the table and listened until the fire burned down to nothing. In the morning, the torch was gone. Only the hole in the ground remained. The following evening, 2 riders appeared at the tree line at the edge of the north pasture. They sat their horses and watched the house from a distance of perhaps 200 yards, not close enough to threaten, close enough to be seen. They held their position until the light failed and then they were gone. Cade sat on the porch both evenings, not hiding, not performing, just present, rifle across his knees, coffee gone cold in the cup beside him. He understood that he was being watched, and that being watched meant being evaluated, and the worst thing he could do was flinch. He also understood, in a way he couldn't fully articulate, that whatever had been done to the woman in the canyon had not been done by her own people. The arrow had been angled wrong for that. And the people on the ridge and at the tree line were not moving like a group that had discarded something and wanted it back. They were moving like a group that had lost something and was trying to understand who had found it. That was a different thing entirely. On the 7th morning, Soaring Hawk came. He came alone, which told Cade everything he needed to know about how seriously the man took himself. A war chief who came alone to a lone rancher's property was not afraid. He was deciding whether the rancher deserved his full attention or only a portion of it. He rode a dark horse, nearly black, with no markings. He wore no paint. He stopped 10 feet from the porch steps and sat his horse and looked at Cade without speaking. Cade stood up from his chair slowly, set the rifle against the wall behind him where it was visible but not threatening, and stepped down 1 step. They looked at each other for a moment. The elder was perhaps 60 years old. His face carried the kind of weathering that comes not just from sun and wind, but from sustained weight, from long seasons of making decisions that other people's lives depended on. His eyes were sharp and unhurried. He took his time looking at Cade the way a man looks at a bridge before trusting his horse across it. Then he said, in English that was careful and deliberate, "Why?" Not a question in the rising sense, a single flat word that required a complete answer. Cade thought about it for only a moment. "She was breathing," he said. He didn't add anything to that. He didn't explain his daughter or his grief or the particular quality of the early morning light in the canyon that had made the decision feel already made before he'd consciously arrived at it. He said the only true thing, which was that she had been alive, and he had responded to that. Soaring Hawk looked at him. He looked at him the way a man reads terrain, slowly, checking for things that might be hidden, for false footing, for places where the ground looks solid but isn't. "You are alone here," Soaring Hawk said. It wasn't quite a question either. "Yes." "You have no wife, no sons?" "No." Another silence. The dark horse shifted its weight slightly. Soaring Hawk held it still with no visible effort. "She is my daughter," he said. Cade nodded once. He had suspected something close to that from the way the riders had moved, protective, not reclaiming, like people searching for something they loved. "I would like to see her," Soaring Hawk said. Cade looked at him for a moment. Then he turned and opened the door and stepped aside. He stood on the porch while the elder went inside alone. He heard the low sound of speaking in Apache, a few words, then quiet, then a few more. He stood in the morning air and looked out at the north pasture and at the tree line where the riders had been, and he breathed slowly and waited. Soaring Hawk came back out after a time. He stood at the top of the porch steps and looked out at the same pasture, and for a moment the two of them stood side by side in silence. "She needs more days," Soaring Hawk said. "Yes," Cade said, "we will not trouble you." "You haven't troubled me." The elder turned and looked at him directly then, not evaluating any more, but something close to acknowledgement. Not warmth, not friendship, something more careful than that. The kind of recognition that passes between two people who understand, without saying it, that the world has just quietly rearranged itself around them. Soaring Hawk mounted his horse and rode back toward the tree line without another word. Cade went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. Sunwing began to heal properly after that. She moved through the house carefully at first, always aware of where the doors and windows were, always with one eye on the distance when she stood at the glass. Cade gave her the run of the place and asked for nothing in return. He cooked simply and left food where she could reach it. He worked outside during the days and came in at dusk, and they sat in the same room with the ease of people who had discovered that silence between strangers can be a form of respect rather than hostility. She spoke some English, not a great deal but enough. She used it sparingly, the way a man uses the last of his water, carefully, and only when it counts. On the 9th evening, she came to the doorway of the kitchen while he was eating and leaned against the frame and watched him for a moment. "The men who did this," she said, "you know one of them." Cade set down his fork. "Tell me." She told him about the morning it had happened. She had been alone, scouting the canyon boundary where her people's grazing land met the edge of what Cade Rourke claimed as territorial range. She had done it many times. It had always been tense but peaceful. That morning, 3 riders had come from the south, white men. One of them she had seen before at the Cade Rourke trading post, a big man on a grey horse. He had ridden ahead of the others and spoken to her in English she only partly understood. Something about boundary, something about paper, something about claim. Then the first arrow had hit. It hadn't come from any of the 3 riders. It had come from the rocks above, a 4th man higher up. The angle of the wound made sense to Cade now, downward, close enough to be deliberate, far enough to be deniable. She had fallen. She had heard them talking low, not urgent, and she had understood enough of it to know they were discussing whether she was dead. One of them had said to leave her. She had lain still and said nothing, and after a while their horses had moved away and she had begun to crawl. "A big man," Cade said. "Grey horse." "Yes." Cade was quiet for a moment. Did he give an order? The big man, did the others look to him? Sunwing thought about it. "Yes," she said, "they looked to him." Cade nodded slowly. He thought about Harlan Briggs at the canyon 2 mornings ago, the expression on his face when he'd seen the woman. Not surprise, not alarm. Something flatter than that. Something that looked, in retrospect, very much like a man calculating how much damage had already been done and whether it could still be contained. "I know him," Cade said. She said nothing. "I'll need your father to know this," Cade said. "What you've told me. He needs to hear it from you, not from me." She nodded once and returned to the other room. 2 days later, Soaring Hawk came again. This time he brought 2 riders with him and stopped at the edge of the yard. Cade came out onto the porch and met his gaze and tilted his head toward the house. Soaring Hawk came in alone again while his riders waited. The conversation was long. Sunwing spoke in Apache and Cade listened to the rhythm of it without understanding the words, and when she stopped, Soaring Hawk translated the essential pieces for Cade in his careful English. He named the 3 riders from Cade Rourke. He named the land they had been trying to claim. He explained the scheme in broad terms, a territorial court filing that would be supported by a surveyor's document, and the surveyor's document would only be credible if the Apache presence along the canyon boundary could be removed. Not pushed back, removed permanently. Cade thought about the legal document Harlan had mentioned once, casually, over a fence line dispute 2 seasons back. Something about boundary recertification, about old Spanish land grants and how they superseded territorial maps. He had not paid much attention at the time. He paid attention now. "How long has this been planned?" Cade asked. Soaring Hawk said something to Sunwing. She answered. "2 seasons," Soaring Hawk said. Cade leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "2 of the riders," Soaring Hawk said then. His voice had changed, slightly quieter, with an edge underneath it like a blade wrapped in cloth. "We have them." Cade looked at him. "We found them at Cade Rourke's south edge, where the trail goes through the rocks." Soaring Hawk's expression did not change. "They are alive. We have held them since yesterday." "What are you going to do with them?" "That," Soaring Hawk said, looking at Cade directly, "depends on what you are going to do." The room was very quiet for a moment. "There is a third," Cade said. "Yes, the large man, the one who gave the order." "He's mine," Cade said. He didn't mean it the way it might have sounded. He clarified immediately, "Not mine to kill, mine to answer for what he did, through law, through the marshal at Cimarron." Soaring Hawk studied him. "That is a long road," the elder said. "It is," Cade said, "but it's the right one." Another silence. Soaring Hawk looked at his daughter. She said something in Apache that Cade couldn't follow. The elder listened, and then he looked back at Cade with something in his face that had shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, like a door left ajar. "The two riders," Soaring Hawk said, "we will leave them at the entrance to Reed Rock, bound with a message." Cade waited. "The message will say, 'The third one is yours.'" Cade understood. He nodded. "They will reach Harlan Briggs before sundown," Soaring Hawk said. "And Harlan Briggs will know that his men have been taken and returned, and he will know that someone who speaks English sent a written message, and he will come to you." "I know. He will not come alone." "I know that too." Soaring Hawk rose from the table. He looked at Cade for a long moment in the way he had looked at him on the first morning, the terrain-reading look. Then he spoke 3 words in Apache that Cade didn't know. Sunwing translated them quietly from across the room. He says, "We will not be far." Cade spent the rest of that day and the following night preparing, not for war, for the specific, careful work of not starting one. He wrote down everything he knew, the names, the dates, the description of the wounds, the account Sunwing had given him, the detail of the arrow's angle, the location in the canyon, Harlan's behavior the morning after. He wrote it on 3 separate pages and sealed 2 of them inside separate envelopes. One he addressed to the territorial marshal at Cimarron. One he addressed to the land office recorder at Santa Fe. The third he kept loose, folded in his coat pocket. He cleaned his rifle and his pistol and loaded both. Not because he intended to use them first, but because a man who goes unarmed into a confrontation with Harlan Briggs is not brave. He is careless, and careless men get buried before the story gets told. Sunwing left at dusk of that day, riding double behind one of her father's riders. Before she left, she stood at the porch for a moment and looked at Cade with the same flat, measuring expression she had worn in the first days of her recovery, but the quality of it had changed. There was something in it now that was neither warmth nor debt. It was something more even than that. The look of a person who has revised their understanding of a stranger and arrived at a conclusion they can live with. She said nothing. He didn't expect her to. He watched them ride north until the dark folded over the trail. Then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table and waited for dawn. Harlan Briggs arrived just as the sun cleared the ridge. He came with 4 men, all of them armed, all of them spread out in the deliberate way of people who have been told to look like they aren't a threat while looking exactly like a threat. Harlan himself rode at the center, the gray horse dark with morning sweat, a folded document in his left hand, and something in his expression that had the careful construction of a man who has rehearsed what he plans to say. Cade was standing on the porch. He had his rifle leaned against the wall behind him. His pistol was on his hip. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched them come across the yard with the same stillness he had used on the ridge and at the tree line and every other morning of this long week. Because stillness, he had learned, communicated more clearly than any weapon. Harlan pulled up 20 feet out. He looked at Cade. He looked at the house. He looked at the ridge. On the ridge, 6 Apache riders sat their horses in a line against the morning sky. Harlan's horse shifted under him. He held it, but the effort was visible. "Rourke," he said. His rehearsed tone had lost some of its certainty. "I've come to settle this boundary matter properly. I have a legal document here from the territorial court that—" "I know what you have," Cade said. Harlan stopped. "And I know what you did in the canyon," Cade said. "I know who was with you. I know which one of them was in the rocks above. And I know that you gave the order, because 2 of your men have already been given time to think clearly. And men with time to think clearly tend to remember things in useful detail." The yard was very quiet. One of Harlan's riders shifted in his saddle. Another one looked up at the ridge and did not look away again. "You're going to get off that horse," Cade said. Harlan's jaw tightened. "I have written accounts of everything I know," Cade continued, "sealed and addressed to the marshal at Cimarron and the land recorder at Santa Fe. If I don't ride them to Cimarron myself within the next 3 days, they get sent by the next rider through. That's already arranged." He let that land for a moment. "So you can think about what you're holding in your hand and decide whether it buys you anything at this point. Or you can get down off that horse and we can ride to Cimarron together, and you can speak for yourself in front of a man whose job it is to listen." Harlan looked at him. He looked at the ridge. He looked back at Cade. "You'd put your word against mine," Harlan said, "a lone rancher with nothing." "Not my word alone," Cade said. "Sunwing's and her father's, and your 2 men who have already said enough to make a court very interested in what the third one has to say." Harlan sat very still. One of his riders, a young man on a bay horse at the far right, reached slowly to his saddle horn with both hands and made no further movement. That was not a surrender gesture exactly. But it was a man removing himself from whatever came next. Then, slowly, Harlan Briggs folded the document in his hand. He folded it once and then again, precisely the way a man folds something he has decided he no longer wants to look at. He put it in his coat pocket. He got down off his horse. Cade came down off the porch and walked toward him. When he reached him, he held out his hand for the pistol at Harlan's hip. Harlan looked at him for a long moment, a look that had some old defiance in it and some calculation, and underneath all of that something that looked like exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a wrong thing for a long time and finally setting it down. He handed over the pistol. Cade took it. He turned to Harlan's 4 riders. "Any of you here because he's paying you," Cade said, "you can go. Any of you here because you believe in what he did, you can go too, but you'd do well to ride somewhere other than Red Rock for a while." He paused. "Any of you here because you already know something you haven't told anyone. The marshal at Cimarron will hear you as a witness before he hears you as a suspect. That window won't be open forever." 3 of them turned their horses and rode south without a word. The young man on the bay horse stayed. He was perhaps 20 years old. He had the look of someone who had been carrying a wrong thing for even less time than Harlan, which meant it was heavier for him, the way fresh weight always is. "I was there," he said. His voice was steady but thin. "At the canyon. I wasn't the one in the rocks, but I was there." "I know," Cade said. I didn't know it would go that far." Cade looked at him for a moment. "Come to Cimarron," he said. "Tell it to the marshal the same way you just told it to me. That's the only thing that helps you now." The young man nodded. Cade looked up at the ridge. The 6 Apache riders were still there, still, unhurried, watching. He looked at Soaring Hawk at the center of the line, and after a moment the elder inclined his head slightly, a minimal gesture, barely visible at that distance, but present. Cade turned and went inside to get his coat and the letters. The ride to Cimarron took 3 days. Cade rode with Harlan Briggs on a lead rope, and the young rider, his name was Ellis Cord, 19 years old, originally from Missouri, riding freely alongside. None of them spoke much. The trail was long and the weather was cool, and the silence between them had the quality of something that had been settled rather than something unresolved. The marshal at Cimarron was a compact, grey-haired man named Aldous Crew, who had been doing the job for 16 years and had long since stopped being impressed by anything. He listened to Cade's account without interrupting. He read the written pages. He took Ellis Cord's statement in a separate room. He looked at the documents Harlan had been carrying and set them aside in a pile that meant something to him professionally. Then he looked at Cade across his desk. "You have an Apache war chief willing to give testimony," he said. "In his own way," Cade said. "He won't come here, but he'll speak to a man who comes to him with proper intent." Crew thought about that. "That's irregular." "Yes," Cade said. "You're asking me to ride out to Apache land and take a statement from a war chief. I'm asking you to ride out and listen to a man who watched his daughter nearly get killed in order to clear the way for a fraudulent land claim. What you do with what he tells you is your job, not mine." Crew looked at him for a long time. "All right," he said. Harlan Briggs was held in the Cimarron jail while Crew made arrangements. The 2 riders who had been delivered bound to Reed Rock were already in custody by the time Cade arrived. Someone in town had sent word ahead, which told Cade that Harlan's network of quiet support was not as solid as Harlan had believed. People had known things. They had simply been waiting for someone to start the process of saying them aloud. Cade stayed in Cimarron for a week while the initial proceedings were organized. He slept in a boarding house, ate at a counter, and spent his evenings writing out additional details that came back to him now that the urgency had passed. Memory works differently after danger. Things settle into order. He wrote carefully and signed each page. On the 5th day, Marshal Crew rode out to the canyon country with a deputy and came back 3 days later, looking as though he had done something he hadn't expected to find meaningful. "That man," Crew said, sitting across from Cade in the same office, "is not a man I would want to tell something untrue to." "No," Cade said, "his account matches yours. It matches Cord's. It matches the physical evidence." Crew folded his hands on the desk. "The land claim is fraudulent. The territorial filing was based on a surveyor's certification that the surveyor has already retracted once he understood what he was looking at. 2 of Briggs's men have agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges." He paused. "Harlan Briggs is going to trial." Cade nodded. "You understand what that means for you," Crew said. "You'll need to testify. It'll be weeks, possibly months. You'll be away from your property." "I understand." Crew looked at him with the expression of a man who is trying to figure out what motivates another man and is coming up slightly short. "You could have let it go," he said. "After the woman recovered, you could have let the Apache handle the 2 they had and gone back to ranching." "I could have," Cade said. "Why didn't you?" Cade thought about it. It wasn't a complicated answer, but it took a moment to find the right words for it. "Because it doesn't end," he said, "if someone doesn't make it end." Crew held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he has heard something that he agrees with but is not surprised to have confirmed. "All right," Crew said. We'll begin in the morning." The trial took 6 weeks. Cade testified on 2 separate days. Soaring Hawk did not come to Cimarron, but a written account translated by a territorial interpreter was entered into the record, and Marshal Crew's own account of his visit to the Apache camp carried the weight of official testimony. Ellis Cord testified clearly and without hesitation. 2 of Harlan's other men testified with less clarity, but enough truth between them to fill the remaining gaps. The land claim was voided by the territorial court in the 4th week. The surveyor's certification was formally withdrawn, and the man who had signed it was fined heavily and stripped of his license. In the 6th week, Harlan Briggs was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, fraudulent land registration, and the unlawful taking and endangerment of a person, the charge that applied most closely to what had been done to Sunwing in the canyon. He was sentenced to 12 years. Cade rode back north after the sentencing with no particular ceremony about it. The return ride was 2 days longer than the ride to Cimarron had been because he took a different route. A longer one that went through open country rather than along the main trail, because he wanted the quiet, and because he had been in rooms with people and paperwork for 6 weeks, and he needed the distance to feel like himself again. He crossed onto his own property at the south fence line on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky low and gray with the beginning of autumn, the grass in the pasture gone tawny at the tips. He noticed the fence immediately. He stopped his horse and looked at it. The East Canyon line, the stretch that had been pulling loose since the spring thaw, the stretch he had loaded his wagon for on the morning he had found Sunwing, had been repaired. Not patched, rebuilt. Every post was set straight, the holes dug fresh and deep, every wire run taut and true and fastened clean at the anchors. The work was thorough and careful and had clearly taken more than 1 day. There was no note, no mark, no sign of who had done it beyond the work itself, which was sign enough. Cade walked his horse slowly along the length of the fence line, running his gloved hand along the top wire, feeling the tension in it, the good, solid tension of wire properly installed, wire that would hold against weather and cattle and time. He walked it from the south corner all the way to the canyon edge, where the fence terminated at a post set so cleanly into the rim rock that it looked like it had grown there. He stopped at the edge and looked out over the canyon. The light was coming in low and sideways from the west, catching the red of the rock and turning it deeper, almost the color of old copper. The canyon floor was in shadow. The ridgeline above it was lit. Somewhere below, in the rocks near the base of the far wall, was the place where he had found Sunwing in the early dark of a morning that now felt like it belonged to a different version of his life. He sat down on the edge of the rim with his heels hanging over the drop and let the light fall on him. He didn't think about Harlan Briggs. He didn't think about the trial or the weeks in Cimarron or the paperwork or the testimony. He didn't think about any of it. He let it settle below the surface the way things do when they're finished, not forgotten, just. He thought about his daughter for a moment, not the shape of her the way he usually did, the abstracted grief shape he carried like a smooth stone in his chest. He thought about her specifically, the way she had laughed at something he couldn't remember now, the way she had argued with him about the best route through the canyon pass, the way she had always known before he did when something needed doing and had already done it before he thought to ask. He sat with that for a while. The light shifted. The red in the canyon deepened. A hawk came off the rim to the south and circled wide over the floor below, riding the thermal that came up off the warm rock in the afternoons, tilting its wings with the small, precise adjustments of a creature completely at ease in its element. Cade watched it until it disappeared over the far ridge. Then he got up, brushed the red dust from his coat, walked back to his horse and rode home. The kitchen was cold, but it warmed quickly once he got the stove going. He put water on for coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the north pasture while it heated, and at the tree line beyond the pasture where the Apache riders had stood in the dusk watching him, measuring him, deciding what kind of man he was. He thought he had given them a fair answer. He poured the coffee and sat at the table and drank it while the last of the light went out of the sky, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary warmth of a house inhabited by a man who had work to do in the morning and knew what it was and was not afraid of it. Outside, the fence line held. The canyon was quiet. The land felt different than it had before, not softened exactly and not made simple, but altered in some small structural way, the way country changes after a hard season and comes through to the other side with its features the same but its character shifted. Stiller, more itself. Cade finished his coffee. He set the cup in the basin. He went to bed. For the first time in 6 years, he slept without waiting for the next thing to go wrong. If this story stayed with you, ride with us again. Subscribe and help keep these frontier tales alive for the next firelit night. Because out here, every name has a past, every trail has a cost, and every sunset still remembers. Until next time, friend. Keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.